No collateral, no credibility, and definitely no loan. Richard Hensley said loud enough for the entire bank floor to hear, his voice slicing through the quiet like a verdict already decided. And just like that, every conversation in the marble-lined lobby slowed to a crawl as eyes turned toward the man standing calmly at his desk. A man in a simple black shirt, dark jeans, and worn leather shoes who didn't look like the kind of client this branch usually entertained, let alone approved for a seven-figure business loan. But Darius Cole didn't flinch. Not when the words landed. Not when a couple seated near the glass office exchanged knowing looks. Not even when Richard leaned back in his chair with that faint, dismissive smile that wasn't about policy. It was about perception, about deciding who belonged and who didn't before the paperwork even hit the desk. And Darius had seen that look before, not once, not twice, but enough times to recognize the pattern before it fully unfolded. The subtle tightening of the jaw, the glance at his clothes instead of his documents, the pause that lingered just a second too long when his name was read aloud. Darius Cole. Richard repeated, tapping the file with a pen like it might reveal something hidden beneath the surface. "You're asking for a $10 million commercial loan with this?" He added, flipping a page without really reading it. And the question wasn't curiosity, it was accusation wrapped in professionalism, the kind that sounded clean but carried weight. And around them the bank continued its quiet rhythm. Keyboards clicking, printers humming, the faint whir of the air conditioning overhead, but the energy had shifted. It wasn't just a transaction anymore. It was a moment, and everyone in the vicinity could feel it building. A young teller across the room slowed her counting just enough to listen. A middle-aged man in a tailored suit pretended to check his phone while angling his body slightly toward the desk. And near the waiting area, a woman adjusted her handbag but didn't sit back down because something about the tone, the posture, the way Richard held the space like authority gave him permission to decide outcomes before facts were even considered. It drew attention, and Darius noticed all of it without turning his head, without shifting in his seat, his posture steady, composed like someone who wasn't here to impress, but to observe, to measure, to confirm something he already suspected. And when he finally spoke, his voice was calm, measured, almost quiet compared to Richard's projection. "Everything you need is in that file," he said, sliding the folder slightly forward. Not as a plea, not as a defense, just a statement. And for a brief second, there was a pause. A small opening where the moment could have gone differently, where professionalism could have taken over, where the numbers could have spoken for themselves, but Richard didn't take it. Instead, he let out a short breath, almost a laugh, and leaned forward, lowering his voice just enough to make it feel personal, but still loud enough for those nearby to catch pieces of it. "We see this all the time," he said, tapping the desk lightly. "People walk in here thinking they can play at this level, but this isn't a walk-in shop, this is a financial institution." And there it was, the shift from evaluation to judgment, from process to assumption, and across the room, a younger employee named Kevin glanced up from his screen, hesitated, then looked back down like he wanted to say something but didn't, like he'd seen this pattern before and knew how it usually ended, and Darius caught that too. Not the words, but the hesitation, the quiet awareness that something about this wasn't right, and still he didn't react, didn't raise his voice, didn't challenge the tone because this wasn't new to him. It was familiar, almost predictable, like a script he'd watched play out in different rooms, different cities, different versions of the same system. And as Richard flipped another page, barely scanning the numbers, he shook his head slowly, sealing his conclusion before the conversation had even properly begun. "I'm going to save you some time," he said, sitting back again, folding his hands. "This loan isn't happening." And the words landed heavier than before, not because of their content, but because of the certainty behind them, the finality that left no room for discussion, no path for appeal, just a closed door delivered with confidence. And for a moment, the entire space seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what Darius would do next, whether he'd argue, push back, demand a second opinion. But instead, he simply nodded once, slow and deliberate-like. He just confirmed something he needed to see with his own eyes. And then he looked up, meeting Richard's gaze fully for the first time. Not with anger, not with frustration, but with something far quieter and far more controlled, something that didn't match the situation on the surface. And when he spoke again, his tone didn't rise, didn't sharpen. It stayed exactly the same, steady, composed. "So that's your final decision?" he asked. And Richard didn't hesitate, didn't reconsider, didn't even glance back at the file. "That's correct," he replied. And in that instant, the decision wasn't just about a loan anymore. It was about everything that came before it, every assumption layered into that moment, every judgment made without evidence, every quiet signal that said you don't belong here. And Darius let the silence sit for just a second longer than necessary. Long enough for the weight of the exchange to settle into the room. Long enough for the people watching to feel it, even if they didn't fully understand it yet. And then, without a hint of urgency, without a trace of emotion, he reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and unlocked it. His expression unchanged, his posture still, like a man who had already moved past the conversation everyone else thought had just ended. And as his thumb hovered over the screen, the room remained quiet, waiting, unaware that the moment they had just witnessed wasn't the conclusion of anything. It was the beginning of something none of them were prepared for. The screen of Darius Cole's phone lit up softly in his hand, a small glow against the polished wood of the desk, and for a moment it looked like nothing more than a routine gesture. Just another client checking a message after being turned away, but the stillness in his posture said otherwise, the kind of stillness that does not come from defeat but from decision. And across from him, Richard Hensley watched with a faint impatience, already shifting his attention to the next file in his stack as if the conversation had ended the second he said no, as if Darius had already been filed away in his mind under people who ask for too much and bring too little, and that quiet dismissal hung in the air heavier than any raised voice could have, while just a few feet away. The young teller who had been listening earlier hesitated again, her eyes flicking between Darius and Richard before settling back on her screen, because something about the exchange did not sit right. Not the numbers, not the tone, not the speed at which the decision had been made, but she stayed silent like everyone else, because in this room silence was safer than interruption, and Darius understood that without needing to look. He had seen it too many times in too many places, the moment where truth hesitates and assumption takes over. And his thumb moved once across the phone, deliberate, precise. And then he lifted it to his ear, his voice low but clear enough to carry just beyond the desk. "Carla, I need you to pull up the Hawthorne file," he said, and there was no hesitation on the other end. Only a calm, immediate response. "It is already open, sir," she replied, her tone professional, steady. Like this was not unexpected, like this moment had been accounted for long before it arrived, and Darius did not look at Richard when he continued. "Initiate phase 1 and notify the board that I am on site." And the words were simple, almost casual, but they did not belong to the situation Richard believed he was controlling. They belonged to something larger, something structured, something already in motion. And for the first time, Richard's pen paused midair just for a fraction of a second. A subtle break in rhythm that most would not notice, but Darius did, because shifts like that mattered. They were the first cracks in certainty, and still Richard said nothing, choosing instead to lean back again and fold his arms, masking the pause with posture, as if posture could restore control. "If you are done here," he said after a moment, his voice measured but tighter now, "I have other clients to attend to." And there was again the quiet push toward the exit, the expectation that Darius would stand up, gather his papers, and leave like every other person who had been told no in that chair. But Darius did not move. He simply placed his phone back on the desk, screen facing up, and rested his hands lightly on either side of it, as if he were waiting for something, not hoping, not guessing, waiting, and that difference began to ripple outward, subtle, but noticeable, because people could feel when a moment refused to end the way it was supposed to. And across the room, the man in the tailored suit lowered his phone completely now, no longer pretending, and the woman near the waiting area remained standing, her attention fixed openly on the desk, because whatever this was, it was not over, not yet, and the silence stretched just long enough to become uncomfortable, not loud, not dramatic, just present. And then Richard cleared his throat slightly, an attempt to reset the space. "Sir," he said, adding a touch of firmness now, "you have your answer." But Darius looked at him again, calm. steady, unshaken. "I heard your answer," he replied, his voice even. "I just wanted to make sure you were certain," and something in that line landed differently. Not confrontational, not aggressive, but precise, like a question that carried weight beyond its words. And Richard's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, because certainty, once stated, does not like to be questioned, especially not in front of an audience. And yet the audience was there, whether he acknowledged it or not. Watching, listening, measuring, in the background a quiet chime echoed from a nearby computer terminal, a routine system notification that normally would have gone unnoticed, but today it felt louder, sharper, like the room itself was responding, and Darius's phone vibrated once against the desk, a soft, controlled signal, and he glanced down at it. Briefly, not hurried, not anxious, just confirming. And then he looked back up, his expression unchanged, as if nothing had shifted at all, even though everything had already begun to move beneath the surface, invisible to most, but not for long, because in spaces like this, where decisions were made in seconds and judgments were passed without evidence, the real power was never in the conversation itself. It was in what followed, and Darius had just set that in motion without raising his voice, without making a scene, without giving anyone the reaction they expected. And that was the part no one in the room understood yet. Not Richard, not the watching clients, not even the employees who sensed something was off but could not name it, because from the outside it still looked like a man who had been denied a loan and had nowhere left to go. But from where Darius sat, steady and composed, it looked like the exact moment everything had begun to turn. The quiet did not break all at once. It shifted, like a slow crack forming beneath a polished surface, barely visible at first, but impossible to ignore once it started. And it began with something small, almost insignificant, the subtle change in the rhythm of the bank floor as one employee refreshed a screen and paused. Then another did the same, their expressions tightening just slightly as unfamiliar notifications appeared where routine data should have been. And across the room, the young teller who had been watching earlier leaned closer to her monitor, her fingers hovering above the keyboard as if unsure whether to proceed, because what she was seeing did not match the usual flow of transactions. It was structured, deliberate, flagged at a level she had never personally encountered, and she glanced toward the back office instinctively, looking for confirmation. But no one came, no one stepped in, because whatever was happening was moving faster than protocol. And at the center of it all, Darius Cole remained exactly where he had been, seated, composed, his gaze steady, as if the unfolding shift around him was not a surprise, but an expectation being fulfilled. And Richard Hensley noticed it too. Not the details, not yet, but the change in atmosphere, the way attention had drifted from his authority to something undefined, something just outside his control. And that irritation flickered across his face before he could mask it. "Is there something else you need?" he asked, his tone sharper now, less patient, as if pressing for closure would restore order. But Darius did not answer immediately. He let the question sit for a moment, then simply said, "No," his voice calm. "I am exactly where I need to be." And that response did not fit the script Richard expected. It did not move the conversation forward or end it. It held it in place, suspended. And that unsettled him more than resistance would have, because resistance he could manage, silence he could dismiss, but certainty without explanation created space for doubt, and doubt was already beginning to spread, subtle but undeniable, as another quiet chime echoed from a nearby workstation, followed by the low murmur of two employees exchanging a glance, one of them whispering something under their breath before quickly looking back down, as if even acknowledging it felt like stepping out of line. And then a third screen flickered, this time in one of the glass offices behind Richard, where a senior associate straightened in his chair and reached for his desk phone, dialing quickly, his expression no longer neutral but focused, intent. And Richard caught that movement out of the corner of his eye, his posture tightening as he turned slightly, just enough to confirm that something was happening beyond his immediate control, something that did not originate from his desk. And for the first time since the conversation began, he hesitated, not outwardly, not enough for most to notice, but enough for Darius to see, because hesitation changes everything. It shifts authority from absolute to uncertain. And Darius recognized that moment the same way he recognized the earlier judgment, as part of a pattern, a predictable sequence where confidence gives way to questioning, and still he did not move, did not press, did not explain, because the power in this moment was not in what he said, it was in what was already in motion, unseen but advancing. And his phone vibrated again, a single controlled pulse against the desk, and he glanced at it briefly before placing it back down, his expression unchanged, as if confirming a checkpoint rather than reacting to new information. And across from him, Richard leaned forward slightly now, his voice lower, more controlled, but carrying an edge that had not been there before. "If this is some kind of misunderstanding," he said, choosing his words carefully, "we can revisit your application through the proper channels." And the shift in language was subtle but significant, from final denial to conditional reconsideration, from authority to adjustment, and it did not go unnoticed by those listening. The man in the tailored suit raised an eyebrow, slightly. The woman near the waiting area shifted her weight, as if leaning further into the moment, because something had changed, something small but undeniable. And Darius met Richard's gaze again, steady, unhurried. "You already made your decision," he said, not accusing, not confrontational, just stating a fact, and that fact carried weight now, more than it had minutes ago, because the room was no longer aligned with Richard's certainty. It was beginning to question it, and in the background the senior associate stepped out of his office, phone still in hand, his eyes scanning the floor until they landed on Richard, then on Darius, and something in his expression tightened, a recognition forming, incomplete but enough to disrupt the narrative that had been in place. And as he started walking toward the desk, the quiet in the room deepened again, not empty, but charged, like the moment before a shift becomes visible to everyone. And Richard followed his movement, his jaw setting as he tried to maintain composure, to hold on to the authority he had established just minutes earlier. But authority built on assumption does not hold well under scrutiny, and scrutiny had just entered the room, step by step, closing the distance, while Darius remained exactly where he was, calm, composed, and entirely unmoved, as if he had already seen how this would unfold and was simply allowing it to arrive on its own time. The senior associate's footsteps were measured but urgent, each one echoing just enough against the polished floor to draw more attention as he closed the distance. And by the time he reached Richard's desk, the quiet had shifted again, no longer passive, no longer uncertain, but focused, as if the entire room had leaned in without moving, waiting for something to be confirmed out loud. And Richard straightened instinctively, his posture tightening as he turned to face him, attempting to re-establish control before any words were spoken. "Is there a problem?" he asked, his tone firm, but carrying a hint of strain that had not been there before, and the associate did not answer immediately, his eyes moving from Richard to Darius, then back again, taking in the scene, the open file, the untouched documents, the tension that lingered in the space between them. And when he finally spoke, his voice was lower, controlled, but unmistakably serious. "Richard, I need you to step aside for a moment," he said, not loudly, not aggressively, but with a weight that did not invite dismissal, and that alone was enough to ripple through the room, because requests like that were not made lightly, not in front of clients, not in the middle of the floor. And Richard hesitated, just a fraction, but it was there, visible now, undeniable. "We are in the middle of a client meeting," he replied, choosing his words carefully, as if precision could anchor the moment back in his favor. But the associate did not shift, did not lower his gaze. "I am aware," he said, and then, just slightly, he angled his body toward Darius, acknowledging him without yet addressing him directly. And that subtle gesture carried more meaning than any introduction could have, because it shifted the frame of the conversation entirely, from manager and applicant to something else, something not yet named but already understood on a deeper level. And around them, the employees who had been quietly watching now made no effort to hide it. Screens were forgotten, tasks paused. Even the hum of conversation in the waiting area had faded to almost nothing, replaced by the kind of silence that builds when people realize they are witnessing something they will remember later, and Darius remained exactly as he had been, seated, composed, his expression steady, as if this moment was simply the next step in a process he had already seen unfold countless times. And Richard felt that shift, even if he could not fully explain it. The way. Control was slipping not through confrontation, but through structure, through something larger than the interaction he thought he was managing. And he cleared his throat again, this time more deliberately. "If there's an issue, we can address it after I finish here," he said, his voice firm, attempting once more to reassert authority, but the associate's response came without hesitation. "This is the issue," he said quietly, and that sentence landed heavier than any raised voice could have, because it did not challenge Richard's authority directly. It bypassed it entirely, placing the moment in a different category, one that did not operate by the same rules. And for the first time, Richard's gaze shifted back to Darius with something new behind it. Not dismissal, not irritation, but uncertainty, and that uncertainty spread quickly, like a ripple moving outward, because once it appeared at the center, it could not be contained, and Darius met his gaze without change, calm, steady, unshaken, offering no explanation, no clarification, just presence. And that absence of reaction forced the room to fill in the gaps on its own, to question what had already been decided, to reconsider what they thought they understood. And in the background, another phone rang, sharp and unexpected, followed by the sound of it being picked up quickly, a hushed voice answering, then pausing, then repeating something with a tone that suggested confirmation, rather than confusion. And the associate's phone buzzed in his hand, a brief vibration that he acknowledged with a glance before slipping it back into his pocket, his expression tightening just slightly as if a final piece had just fallen into place. And then he turned fully toward Darius, this time with clear recognition, not dramatic, not exaggerated, but undeniable. And that recognition changed the air in the room more than anything else had so far, because it introduced something concrete into the uncertainty, something real, something that connected the quiet authority Darius carried with a structure the bank itself could not ignore. And Richard saw it, saw the shift in the associate's posture, the way his attention had realigned, and in that moment the confidence he had started with began to fracture, not loudly, not all at once, but in small, irreversible ways. And he tried to speak again, to regain footing, to redirect the conversation back to familiar ground. "If there has been some confusion regarding the application," he began, but the words felt thinner now, less certain, because the foundation they rested on was no longer stable. And before he could continue, the associate raised a hand slightly, not to silence him, not overtly, but enough to pause the momentum. And then he spoke, measured, precise. "I think it would be best if we reviewed the full context before making any further statements." And that sentence did not accuse, did not confront, but it carried a clear implication that the context was larger than what had been considered, larger than the file on the desk, larger than the assumptions already made. And as those words settled the room, shifted once more, not toward resolution, not yet, but toward realization, the slow, undeniable awareness that something significant was unfolding, something that had already begun to move beyond individual judgment and into a space where decisions carried consequences far greater than anyone had anticipated just minutes earlier. And at the center of it all, Darius Cole remained still, composed, and entirely in control without ever having raised his voice. The room did not erupt. It tightened, like a held breath that had gone on too long. And in that tension, something old surfaced in Darius Cole's mind, not as a distraction, but as a quiet echo that sharpened his focus, a memory from years earlier when he had stood in a different office, younger, less established, wearing his best suit at the time, asking for a fraction of what sat on the desk in front of him now. And he remembered the same pause, the same look, the same careful wording that masked a decision already made before the numbers were even reviewed. "You are not the right profile for this level of financing," the loan officer had said back then, polite but firm. And Darius had walked out that day with nothing but a handshake and a lesson that stayed longer than any approval ever could, because it was never just about the money. It was about who was believed capable of holding it, and now standing in a bank that measured worth in numbers, but judged it in seconds. That same pattern had revealed itself again, not louder, not harsher, just as precise as before, and the memory faded as quickly as it came, leaving behind clarity instead of frustration. Because this time the outcome would not depend on someone else's perception. It would depend on structure, on ownership, on decisions that did not require permission. And across from him, Richard Hensley shifted his weight slightly. The confidence he carried at the beginning now uneven, as if he could feel the ground beneath the conversation changing without knowing exactly why. If there has been a miscommunication, he said, his voice controlled but noticeably softer than before. We can revisit the application with additional documentation. And the offer hung there. An attempt to rewind, to adjust the narrative without admitting the initial misjudgment. But Darius did not reach for the folder, did not move to reopen the discussion, because that moment had already passed, and he had no interest in negotiating a decision that had revealed more than it intended to hide. You already evaluated everything you needed, he replied calmly, his tone unchanged. And that statement did not challenge Richard directly. It reflected his own process back at him, and in doing so it made the earlier certainty harder to revise, because revision now would not look like fairness. It would look like correction, and correction in front of witnesses carries weight. And the witnesses were no longer pretending to be uninvolved. The man in the tailored suit had stepped closer now, his phone lowered but still in his hand. The woman near the waiting area had moved just enough to have a clear view of the desk, and even the employees behind the counters were no longer fully engaged in their tasks. Their attention divided, drawn to the center where the shift was becoming impossible to ignore, and the senior associate remained beside the desk, his presence steady, his attention focused on Darius with a level of recognition that had not yet been spoken out loud, but was already understood in posture alone. And his phone buzzed again, this time longer, more insistent. And when he checked it, his expression changed in a way that confirmed something final, something that moved the situation beyond internal uncertainty and into formal acknowledgement. And he exhaled slowly before speaking, not to Richard this time, but to Darius. "Sir, I believe there may be additional context that was not considered here," he said, carefully, respectfully, and the use of that word, sir, landed with precision, because it reframed the dynamic in a way that document on the desk could have done. And Richard heard it too, his gaze snapping briefly toward the associate before returning to Darius. Searching now, recalculating, trying to align what he was seeing with what he thought he knew. And that gap between perception and reality widened with every second, because nothing in Darius's appearance had changed, nothing in his demeanor had shifted. But the room was beginning to treat him differently, and that difference did not come from explanation. It came from recognition, and recognition spreads faster than denial once it begins. And in the background, the teller who had hesitated earlier finally stood, taking a cautious step toward the back office, as if to confirm what her screen had already suggested, and another employee followed her movement with their eyes, then checked their own system, their expression tightening as the same information appeared consistent, undeniable, and still unfolding. And Darius remained exactly where he was, his hands resting lightly on the desk, his phone silent now, as if the instructions he had given earlier were no longer in progress, but already executed. And he looked at Richard once more, not with accusation, not with satisfaction, but with clarity, the kind that does not need to be explained because it speaks through timing, through sequence, through the quiet understanding that the decision made minutes ago had already set something much larger into motion. And when he spoke again, his voice was steady, deliberate. "You made your call based on what you thought you saw," he said, and then, after a brief pause that let the words settle fully into the space, he added, "Now you get to see the rest of it." And the room did not respond with noise. It responded with attention, every eye fixed, every movement slowed, because whatever came next was no longer just about alone. It was about a shift in power that had already begun and could no longer be reversed. The shift did not arrive with noise. It arrived with confirmation, quiet but undeniable, as if the entire system beneath the polished floors and glass walls had finally caught up to the moment unfolding at the desk. And it began with the sound of a single email notification echoing from the senior associate's phone, followed almost immediately by another from a terminal behind the counter. Then another, until the pattern became too consistent to dismiss as coincidence. And the associate did not hesitate this time. He stepped slightly forward, his posture no longer neutral but aligned, his attention fully centered on Darius Cole. "Sir," he said again, more firmly now, "the board has just confirmed receipt of the acquisition notice." And the words landed in the space like a key turning in a lock, precise, mechanical, final. And for a moment, Richard Hensley did not react, not outwardly, as if his mind needed an extra second to process what had just been said, to reconcile the term acquisition with the conversation he thought he was having just minutes earlier. And when it registered, his expression shifted in a way that could not be hidden. The certainty gone, replaced by something sharper, more urgent. "Acquisition," he repeated, his voice lower now, stripped of its earlier confidence. And the associate nodded once, not dramatically, just enough to confirm. "Yes," he said. "The controlling stake transfer has been finalized pending in-branch acknowledgement." And that phrase, "in-branch acknowledgement," carried weight because it meant this was not theoretical, not preliminary. It was active, in motion, and tied directly to the space they were standing in, and around them the room absorbed the information in silence. Not because it was unclear, but because it was too clear, too immediate, too far removed from what anyone expected when the conversation began. And the man in the tailored suit straightened fully now, his attention fixed without hesitation. The woman near the waiting area brought her hand slowly to her mouth, not in shock, but in realization, because the pieces were aligning faster than anyone could ignore. And behind the counter, one of the employees took a step back from their station, eyes wide but focused, as if seeing the system not as a routine tool, but as something larger, something that could shift roles in real time. And at the center of it all, Darius remained still, composed, his expression unchanged, as if the words being spoken were not new information, but confirmation of a process he had already set into motion before he ever walked through the door. And Richard felt that difference, the gap between reaction and control, and it unsettled him in a way that no argument could have, because arguments could be managed, challenged, redirected. But this was structural, procedural, backed by layers he did not have immediate access to. And he turned slightly toward the associate, his voice tighter now. "There must be some mistake," he said, but even as he spoke the words lacked conviction, because the room itself was no longer supporting that narrative. And the associate shook his head once, calm but certain. "There is no mistake," he replied. "The documentation has cleared, and the primary stakeholder is present." And with that, he shifted his gaze back to Darius, not subtly this time, but directly, openly. And that final alignment of attention completed the transition that had been building since the first moment Richard spoke, because now the room no longer saw an applicant, no longer saw a request. It saw position, ownership, authority defined not by assumption, but by confirmation. And Richard followed that gaze slowly, his own settling on Darius with a new awareness that replaced every earlier judgment he had made. And for a brief second he did not speak, did not move, as if recalculating. Everything he had said, every tone, every decision, every dismissal. And Darius met his eyes without change, calm, steady, entirely grounded in the moment. And then, without raising his voice, without shifting his posture, he spoke. "You asked for collateral," he said, his tone even, almost conversational. And then, after a slight pause that let the words settle fully, he added, "I brought the institution." And the sentence did not echo loudly. It did not need to, because its weight carried through the room in a way volume never could. And no one interrupted. No one responded immediately, because the clarity of it left no space for confusion, no room for reinterpretation. And in that silence, the shift completed itself. Not dramatically, not explosively, but definitively, as systems updated, roles adjusted. And the reality of the situation replaced the assumptions that had shaped it just minutes earlier. And Darius remained exactly where he had been from the beginning, seated, composed, and entirely in control without ever needing to ask for permission. The silence that followed did not feel empty. It felt heavy, like a room that had just witnessed something irreversible. And for a moment, no one moved. Not the employees behind the counters, not the clients standing just a few feet away, not even Richard Hensley, who remained frozen in place, as if the words he had just heard had disconnected him from the authority he believed he held. And it was not the statement itself that shook the room. It was the certainty behind it, the absence of doubt, the complete lack of need for validation, because Darius Cole had not argued his position. He had revealed it, and revelation does not invite debate, it ends it. And slowly the system around them began to reflect that reality in ways no one could ignore. Screens updated in quiet succession, internal dashboards refreshing with new access levels, new permissions, new identifiers that placed Darius at the top of a structure that had just minutes ago questioned his presence within it. And one by one, the employees began to notice, first with confusion, then with recognition, and finally with understanding, because the data did not lie. The system did not speculate. It confirmed, and once confirmed, it did not reverse. And the young teller who had hesitated earlier now stood completely still, her eyes locked on her monitor, as the name she had only glimpsed before appeared again. This time not as a line in a file, but as a controlling authority within the institution itself. And she looked up slowly, her gaze finding Darius with a new clarity that replaced the uncertainty she had carried moments before. While across the room the man in the tailored suit exhaled quietly, shaking his head once as if acknowledging the shift with a kind of respect, because power recognized power even when it was not announced, and Richard saw all of it, every glance, every adjustment, every subtle realignment of attention that moved away from him and toward the man he had just dismissed. And that realization hit deeper than any direct confrontation could have, because it did not challenge his authority, it replaced it. And for the first time since the interaction began, he did not try to speak immediately. He did not try to correct or redirect. He simply stood there, processing the weight of what had unfolded in front of him. And when he finally found his voice, it came out quieter, stripped of its earlier certainty. "Mr. Cole," he said, the name now carrying a different tone, one that acknowledged rather than evaluated. "If I had known," he started, but the sentence did not finish, because even as he said it, he seemed to understand the problem with it. The implication that knowledge would have changed the behavior, and that implication was exactly what had been exposed. And Darius did not interrupt, did not react with satisfaction or frustration. He simply watched, calm, steady, allowing the realization to complete itself without interference, because this moment was not about correction. It was about clarity, and clarity does not need to be forced. It arrives on its own when the truth becomes unavoidable. And the senior associate stepped slightly to the side now, giving space but not withdrawing. His posture aligned with Darius in a way that was no longer subtle, his role shifting from observer to support. And in the background, another message came through, this time on the main branch system, a formal notification that displayed across multiple terminals at once, confirming the change in ownership structure, the completion of the controlling stake transfer, and the requirement for immediate internal compliance review. And that was the final layer, the official acknowledgement that moved the moment from realization to record, from observation to documentation. And once it appeared, there was no room left for interpretation, no space for doubt, and Richard saw it reflected not just in the screens, but in the faces around him, the employees who now stood straighter, more attentive, the clients who watched with open interest rather than quiet curiosity, the entire room recalibrating in real time to a new understanding of who held authority within these walls. And Darius let the moment settle fully before he spoke again, his voice steady, controlled, carrying through the space without force. "You did not deny me because of my numbers," he said. And then, after a brief pause that held the attention of everyone present, he added, "You denied me because of what you decided I represented." And the words were not loud, not aggressive, but they landed with precision, because they did not accuse without basis. They described what had already been seen, what had already been felt by those watching, and Richard lowered his gaze slightly, not in defeat, but in recognition, because there was no argument left to make, no justification that could stand against what had been revealed in both action and outcome. And the room remained still, not waiting for conflict, but absorbing the shift, understanding that what had just happened was not a reversal built on chance. It was a correction built on truth, and at the center of it all, Darius Cole remained composed, grounded, and entirely unchanged from the moment he first sat down, proving without saying it that real power does not need to raise its voice to be heard. It only needs to stand still long enough for everything else to move around it. The shift did not stop at recognition. It moved forward with precision, quiet but absolute, as the systems that had confirmed Darius Cole's authority began to enforce it, not through raised voices or dramatic declarations, but through structured action that unfolded in real time. And the first visible sign came from the terminals behind the counter where access panels refreshed again, this time locking certain functions and flagging others for review, and one employee instinctively reached for a control they had used countless times before, only to pause as the system denied the input. Not with error, but with restriction, a clear signal that permissions had changed, and that change was not temporary. It was structural, and the senior associate's phone rang, sharp and direct, and he answered immediately, his posture straightening further as he listened, nodding once before responding. Understood, initiating compliance now. And when he ended the call, he turned toward Darius, not for instruction, but for alignment. Corporate has authorized immediate internal review of all branch-level decision protocols, he said, his voice steady but carrying weight. Effective. Immediately. And the words landed like a formal reset, not just of authority, but of accountability, and Richard Hensley felt it fully now. Not as a possibility, not as a concern, but as a consequence, because this was no longer about a single decision at a desk. It was about a pattern that had just been exposed in front of witnesses and recorded by systems that did not forget. And he took a slow breath, his shoulders lowering slightly as the realization settled deeper. "Mr. Cole," he said, again, this time with care, with intention, "I would like to clarify that my evaluation was based on standard risk assessment procedures." And the statement was controlled, professional, but it carried the unmistakable tone of defense, of someone trying to place structure around a decision that had already been revealed as something else. And Darius listened without interruption, his expression unchanged, his posture steady, allowing the explanation to exist without validating it. And that lack of reaction spoke louder than disagreement could have, because it made the justification feel smaller, narrower, confined to its own limits. And around them the room continued to adjust. The employees who had once moved with routine now moved with awareness, their actions more deliberate, their attention sharper, as if the space itself had been recalibrated to a higher standard in an instant. And the young teller who had stepped back earlier now returned to her station with a different posture. Her movements precise, her focus clear, no longer uncertain about what she was witnessing, but fully aware of its significance. And the man in the tailored suit gave a slight nod toward Darius. Not openly, not performative, just enough to acknowledge what had just taken place. And even the woman near the waiting area relaxed her stance slightly, her expression shifting from tension to something closer to respect, because the moment had moved beyond conflict and into resolution, not through confrontation, but through truth being made visible. And Darius finally spoke again, his voice calm, measured, carrying across the space without effort. "Standard procedures are only as fair as the people who apply them," he said, and then he paused briefly, letting the sentence settle before continuing. "And today those procedures revealed something they were not supposed to, and the words were not harsh, not accusatory, but they carried clarity, the kind that does not need emphasis to be understood." And Richard lowered his gaze again, not out of submission, but out of recognition, because there was no way to reframe what had already been demonstrated, no way to return to the version of events that existed before the system confirmed what it had. And the senior associate stepped forward slightly, his voice now taking on a more formal tone as he addressed Richard directly. "Per corporate directive, your current decision authority is suspended pending review," he said each word precise, controlled, leaving no room for ambiguity, and the statement did not echo loudly. But its impact was immediate, visible in the way Richard's posture shifted, in the way the space around him subtly changed, as if the role he had occupied moments earlier had been quietly removed and replaced with something else, something accountable, something under examination, and no one spoke over it. No one interrupted, because the structure of the moment did not allow for it. And Darius remained seated, composed, his presence unchanged from the beginning, not elevated by the shift, but revealed by it. And that distinction mattered, because it showed that power had not been created in this moment, it had been uncovered. And as the systems continued to update, as the branch adjusted to its new reality, the room settled into a different kind of silence, one that did not carry tension but understanding, the kind that follows a correction that cannot be undone. And at the center of it all, Darius Cole sat calmly, not needing to say more, because everything that needed to be understood had already been made clear. The room did not return to what it had been before, because moments like this do not reset, they redefine, and as the system stabilized and the notification slowed, a new rhythm settled into the space, one that carried awareness instead of assumption. And Darius Cole remained seated for a few seconds longer, not out of hesitation, but intention, allowing the full weight of what had occurred to anchor itself in the minds of everyone present. Because real change is not in the announcement, it is in the understanding that follows it. And when he finally stood, the movement was simple, unhurried, but it drew every eye again, not because it demanded attention, but because it had earned it. And the difference between those two things was now clear to everyone in the room. And Richard Hensley stepped back slightly, instinctively creating space, not instructed, not told, but responding to a shift he could no longer control. And for a moment their positions reversed without a word, the man who had once held authority now standing in reflection of it. And Darius adjusted his jacket lightly, his expression unchanged, his composure intact, as if nothing about his identity had shifted despite everything around him being forced to catch up. And he looked at Richard once more, not with resentment, not with satisfaction, but with a clarity that carried something deeper than either. "This was never about alone," he said, his voice calm, steady, reaching the edges of the room without effort, and the sentence settled immediately. Because everyone there knew it was true, they had felt it from the beginning, even if they could not name it. And now it had been named. And once named, it could not be denied. And he continued, his tone unchanged. It was about judgment made before information, decisions made before understanding. And the words were not rushed, not emotional. They were precise, deliberate, each one placed with the same control he had carried from the moment he walked in. And the employees listened differently now, not as observers of a situation, but as participants in a standard that had just been raised around them. And the senior associate stood quietly to the side, allowing the moment to unfold without interruption, because this was not a procedural step, it was a statement, and statements like this do not come from systems. They come from leadership. And Darius took a slow breath before finishing. "You did not see risk," he said, his eyes steady on Richard. "You saw a version of me that fit a decision you had already made." And the sentence landed without force, but with impact, because it described something everyone had witnessed without needing to point to it directly. And Richard did not respond immediately, not because he lacked words, but because he understood that any response would exist inside a moment that had already moved beyond him. And so he nodded once, small, controlled, a recognition that did not erase what had happened but acknowledged it. And that acknowledgement carried more weight than any defense could have, and Darius let the silence follow, not filling it, not softening it, because silence in this moment allowed the truth to remain clear without distraction. And then he shifted his attention briefly to the room, not addressing anyone individually, but including everyone in the understanding. "This institution will operate on facts," he said, "not assumptions." And the statement was not loud, not dramatic, but it carried forward, embedding itself into the space as something that would remain long after the moment passed. And behind the counters, the employees stood straighter, more attentive, not out of fear, but alignment, because they understood the standard had changed and that they were now part of maintaining it. And the clients who had witnessed everything began to move again, slowly, conversations resuming in quieter tones, but with a different awareness than before because they had seen something real unfold, something that did not rely on spectacle, but on structure. And Darius turned back toward the desk one final time, placing his hand briefly on the folder that had started the interaction, not to reclaim it, not to reopen it, but to close the loop on what it represented. And then he stepped away, his movement steady, composed, as if the outcome had never been in question from his perspective. And as he walked toward the exit, the path opened naturally, not because anyone was told to move, but because they understood, and that understanding was the final shift, the quiet recognition that dignity does not need to be announced, it only needs to be maintained. And just before he reached the door, he paused for a fraction of a second, not turning back, not addressing the room again, but allowing the moment to settle fully behind him. And then he continued forward, leaving the space transformed, not by force, not by volume, but by a standard that had been raised without compromise. And in the stillness that followed, one thing remained clear to everyone who had witnessed it. He had not raised his voice, he had raised the standard, and nothing in that room would operate the same way again.